All right. Happy, beautiful, amazing day. Dr. Bob Rakowski here with this week's podcast edition with Zane Griggs. You know, if you're actually watching rather than listening, you're going to see an amazing individual, 53 years young is how I'm going to describe him. Podcast Health After 50, Vibrant Health, and he's quite good at modeling that, sharing that, delivering that. 25 plus years helping people get better. And most recently, you are a documentary host about food. And, you know, most of us love food. So let's have a little insight to that. What is that documentary all about?
Well, it's called Animal. At least that's a tentative topic or tentative title. We're exploring the relationship between humans and animals for food as meat, basically. So talking from ranchers to health coaches, to really distinguish between kind of the industrial system versus a ranching system and derivative ag, as well as dispelling some of the myths around meat and health that we've been hearing for the last, probably 50 years now, I think, at least 40, and a lot of fear mongering around meat, which is what humans have been existing on since we've been humans. So that's really the plot of the documentary. We're trying to make it like a story form. So it's going to be a documentary film rather than and try not to pound people with a lot of facts and figures, but really kind of bring them into a story, so to speak.
Right. So what is the story you want to tell, right? What are the myths and why do you think meat became so vilified?
That's a great question. I think there's a lot of politics and money behind that. And I could probably go back, everywhere from Procter and Gamble, kind of buying off the American Heart Association, to Ansel Keys trying to make a name for himself, to the food pyramid, which became very politically driven. I think money driven as well by industry. I think we have a lot of food industry. I think if you've been paying attention, you've probably heard a lot of that being discussed in the media now. But a lot of food industry influence over our national nutrition recommendations or government nutrition recommendations. And that's really what we're trying to come up against is like, all we have to do is go back about 150 years of history. We don't have to go that far back to see that we didn't have disease like we have now. We didn't have chronic disease. We didn't have heart disease, obesity, and diabetes like we do now. They were almost non-existent. 1900, 1% obesity, heart disease hadn't even been kind of documented. I think the first heart attack documented was 1912. Type 2 diabetes was associated with alcoholism. We really weren't even charting it. And we didn't have processed food then. We basically ate like we ate from the farm. It was all whole food meat from the farm, hunted, and what we raised, and what we could grow. And so it's really looking at, it's like, well, okay, chronic disease doesn't come from the food we've always eaten. It's a novel disease. It doesn't come from an ancient food. It's got to come from a novel food.
I'm going to share. First, I'm going to ask you a question, and
Sure.
And then I'm going to put a little qualifying factor on it. But are we living longer as a species, as a population, than we were in 1850?
If you account for infectious disease and child, either at birth or child, like say under 5, infant mortality.
Yep.
I would say no.
You are exactly on it. There's a medical historian, medical researcher. He published in the Journal of Royal Society of Medicine. He said if a child got to be 5 in 1850, their life expectancy was 80. And those were 80 healthy years where they were productive up until the very end. And so you're right. Doctors were, they were delivering babies in hospitals and not washing their hands. And
right.
They would do an autopsy, and people can look up Semmelweis, but it is an absolute lie to think that medicine has us living longer, that what they've done with the food supply has us living longer. In fact, what they do is they keep us miserable longer. So let's get back to this 150 years ago and what were people eating back then? And then let's shift to what's going on now, because it's not food. It's a science fair project.
For sure. It's been well constructed. It's very well planned, well funded science fair project. But so people, were hunting and they were raising animals. They were raising beef. They were hunting, game, turkey, eggs. People ate what they raised or killed, basically, and then traded. Right? They traded with neighbors. Someone might be growing corn. Another one is got wheat, and they're making their own bread. And maybe they have beans or some other sort of veggie that they're trading for, or other type of food, meat or eggs. But there was some bartering, but it was all came off a farm or something you got out in the wild. And then you might go to the general store for staples like basics like flour, salt, maybe a little sugar for baking and for cooking. But you basically just went to the store for those staples in order to help you with food prep. But you weren't buying your food at the store. You were making your food. You were raising your food or bartering with someone else who's doing the same. And so now we've got, like you said, the science project in all the aisles of the grocery store.
I did a fire walk with an Indian chief 30 years ago. And it was very, very fascinating, right? It was a big ritual. Gathered the wood. We created the fire. There was music. There was some level of chanting that might not resonate with some people, but it changed the energy. And we walked on these hot coals, but it was an evening of phenomenal education because he talked about their relationship with the animals. And he talked about the buffalo and how they would, as a tribe, pray for the buffalo and the hunt and everybody on it. When they took the buffalo, they honored the buffalo, and they used everything from head to toe and everything in between, the bone marrow, nothing went to waste. And now let's compare that with industrial agriculture. So what's your take on that? How do you get there? And what do we need to do to solve this mess?
Well, industrial agriculture is, I think, the beginning of the problem because it makes all of that processed food cheaper for these processed food companies to make really cheap, low quality food. We're subsidizing these from the Farm Bill. We're subsidizing these crops, these three main crops of wheat, corn, and soy. Less than a single-digit percentage of that Farm Bill goes to fruits and vegetables, and we have very little going to regenerative agriculture either, which really could be, I think, the future, the answer for what we're doing. But there's another effect of that monocropping, which is the soil, and we're farming the soil into dirt, and that comes from overuse of that soil in a way that doesn't allow for cover crops, doesn't allow for animals to come back over and return nutrients. And when you have dirt instead of soil, what that soil does not do, or that dirt does not do, is it doesn't absorb carbon from the atmosphere like it's supposed to, which is what it traditionally, that's the life cycle, right? Is grasslands and prairies and stuff to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and bring it into the soil. And the cows and the ruminants, like buffalo, like you mentioned, did that. They're part of the ecosystem. They're part of what kept that soil. They put the nutrients back in, they pull on it, and they eat the right grasses, and it's an ecosystem that has a full cycle. And we've disrupted that, and we're seeing the impact of that. But beyond the ecology and the environmental impact of removing animals from the land and overcropping and monocropping, we've created this epidemic where it's a lot easier to make factory food and cheaper to make factory food than it is to make real food and raise real food. And it's changed a lot of our perspective as to what food should cost. I think food has become too easy. It used to be scarce. Food used to have some level of scarcity to it. And now it's become so convenient and so cheap that it has become entertainment, it's become comfort in its first and every sense. It's lost we've lost our sense of reverence for food. Are you going to sit down and say thank you like those Native Americans were thankful for the buffalo? Are we thankful for, Twinkies and Pop-Tarts and Coke and all sorts of processed whatever you want to pull from the grocery store that's in those middle aisles that contains really three main ingredients: processed oils, processed seed oils, if some people call them, or plant oils, highly processed grains, and processed sugars. That's the three main ingredients of those. And so who's thankful for that? I mean, really just had a lot to be thankful for. But it's become so convenient, so easy to get, and it's lost its meaning. I think food has lost its meaning as far as nourishment and as a source of life for us.
There was so much in what you just said. So I want to say a few things on that. One,
Sure.
Right now, the amount of calories we get per dollar are cheaper than ever, right? And that's why we're obese. But the amount of nutrients per calorie is at an all-time low. So, what we really, really want are those nutrients. And then you talk about those seed oils, which are pro-inflammatory. And, we have a profoundly inflamed society. Here's what I teach doctors, students, patients all over the world. We need inflammation. Inflammation precedes repair. But when we don't have what we need to buffer that inflammation burns us up and burns us out. And every time someone ingests any seed oil, they're becoming inflamed. Anytime they want to get a processed grain, they're inflamed. Anytime they get a processed sugar, they're inflamed. And keep in mind, 200 years ago, the average person got just a few pounds a year of processed sugar. We peaked in the 1990s at 153 pounds per person per year. And we're a little less than that because of artificial sweeteners, which are just, they're worse. They're actually worse than the sugar itself. So what a mess that we've actually created. While we're on food, have you played with the carnivore diet? Do you have an opinion on that?
I'm very familiar with it. I know a lot of people who are in the carnivore diet. We from that documentary I mentioned, we interviewed several carnivore docs. I wrote a book with a carnivore, with a doctor in the carnivore and ketovore space named Dr. Ken Berry. And so I'm very familiar with the carnivore diet. I see it as a great elimination diet. And it's great for autoimmune. You want to clear up your gut, maybe turn some of your food cravings or food habits around, because it will give you a lot of satiety. I'm not sold on it as a long-term approach personally. I think once people get metabolically healthy, I think there's probably, and they're exercising, I think there's a place for whole food carbohydrates for energy and for building muscle and for eliminating some of the stress that has come with a very low carb diet that's dependent on gluconeogenesis for all blood sugar, and a lot of the acidosis that can be created through the processing of those proteins and fats for really the proteins turned into glucose, because we do need glucose. We use glucose every second, right? So I look at it as a therapeutic and a great one. But I think it needs to be used appropriately, like any dietary strategy.
You and I are on the same page. We're omnivores, right? We have things that can tear, things that can grind, right? Whether we're talking canines or incisors or molars. So we have a hybrid. We have a hybrid entire digestive tract. So I'll use a carnivore reset 7 to 10 days. And like you said, high blood pressure, diabetic, those do really, really well with that. I'm going to take a moment and go to our sponsor real quick, bettercoffeeshop.com, the world's best reishi-infused organic coffee, voted the best coffee in the entire world. Bettercoffeeshop.com. Take our 1-box challenge, get the 1-box experience. I think you're going to love it, and you are going to be a customer for life. So now, in our preview conversation before we started recording, we talked about the big 3: eat, move, sleep. We focused a bit on food at this point in time. So if you were to just summarize, do you have some simple food recommendations that people can start acting on now to get better?
Well, I would eliminate processed food as much as possible. If it sneaks in there and it's 10% of your diet, okay, you probably get away with it. But, at least 80-90% of your diet should come from a single ingredient source. It shouldn't have an ingredients label on it. Ideally, it should be beef or pork or an egg or an apple or, a banana or a mushroom, whatever it is, it needs to be a single ingredient. If it's olive oil, make sure it's pure olive oil if that's what you're using, or butter or ghee or whatever it is you're cooking with. Make sure it hasn't been adulterated. And because those seed oils do sneak into a lot of olive oils and avocado oils, especially. So make sure you're getting good stuff there to cook with. But I think, it's stick to single ingredient food and then find your ratios. I think adequate animal protein is important for satiety and for building muscle, which we all should be thinking about, especially if you're over 40. Your mind should be on holding on to as much muscle as possible. Muscle retention through that, and that's the best source of protein, in my opinion. But with whole food sources around it that work with your system. If something upsets your stomach, okay, you don't have to eat it, but find whole foods that work with your plan, your strategy for the moment. Whatever that is, whether it's weight loss now or building muscle later or what. Find your own strategy. Know there's going to be nuance, but stick to whole food.
I like that. And you emphasize protein, which, by the way, I've taught nutrition all over the world for over 30 years. Protein comes from the word, which means of primary importance, right? There's a lot of people that just don't get enough of that. So do you have a guideline? How much protein per meal? How many protein meals per day? What about intermittent fasting, stuff like that? How does protein and all that fit in?
That can get, I get a little complex with the intermittent fasting in there. I like to give people a goal of 0.8 to 1 gram of protein per pound of ideal body weight or their goal body weight. I understand some people might think that's a lot and I think they can work their way up to it over time, but I think that's going to give them the satiety they want and help them build the muscle that we're talking about. I like, depending on where they are in their routine and what they're trying to accomplish, as a middle ground, 3 meals a day, and try to divide that protein into 3 meals. If someone's really getting aggressive about building and they want to go with 4 to get more food in, I understand that. I wouldn't do more than that. I like eating within a 12-hour window. Intermittent fasting, in my personal experience working with people, and I used to be a big on intermittent fasting. I started playing with it in 2010, and I did fasted workouts, a lot of intermittent fasting. I'm not crazy about it for women these days because I think that the cortisol and the impact on their energy system is is too great of an impact on the stress response, and they're more likely to maybe have an issue with disrupted sex hormones from that. And I just don't think the energy system is up for it. For men, if you're trying to make an aggressive move towards losing some body fat, probably handle it. I still think you need to watch the stress response. Everybody's a little different. Personally, I hit a wall with it. My cortisol levels, I think, got a little too high. I just started disrupting my sleep. I was cranking it a little too hard with all the other stressors I had going on, maybe some too many fasted workouts along with that. I just found it was overtraining me a little too much. I wasn't getting enough calories in. So I backed away from it. But I do think if you're going to do it, I think your eating window should be during the daylight hours as much as possible. Whereas I tended to do it from lunch to dinner, I think it would probably be better to start like morning to early afternoon, just because of our chronobiology, just to take the food in when we're most active and to really let the digestive system go into that parasympathetic state as the sun goes down. And so to let our whole body go into that state, I should say, by not feeding the digestive system and making it work, not putting a lot of protein to digest. I found with my clients, the earlier they can finish their last meal, whether they're intermittent fasting or not, the better their sleep is. And as we get older, sometimes that's one of the bigger challenging things.
I wear 2 different biometric devices, right? And I'm always tracking my sleep and figuring out what works. And you're right. Getting a meal too late is proven to disrupt sleep, heart rate variability, all those things like that. But you also mentioned women, and people do need to realize that we are profoundly different. The same strategies don't work. And women, especially in their childbearing years, intermittent fasting, especially the first half of the menstrual cycle is really challenging for them. So I'm going to say, eat as consistently as you need to, exercise, always make good choices. And then you don't have to worry about as much that level of restriction because there's always a price to pay. Right.
Yeah. I think every dietary approach has its risks and benefits, and you've got to weigh out what's best for you at this time for you, whether it's you at whatever age or whatever you are in your health journey. If weight loss is more important or changing some sort of metrics is more important, then you might need that stressor. But as you get further along in the stage of what gets you from A to B might not get you from B to C. And then as we get older, we've got to understand the nuance of that, and that stress gets harder to manage. We need more recovery from workouts. We need better sleep. And our diet can add to that stressor unnecessarily if we're not careful.
One thing I've worked with a lot of trainers, including some pretty famous ones and athletes as well. And I like the idea of train hard, recover harder.
Yeah.
And, when you were talking about the intermittent fasting, it seems like you were not recovering hard enough.
Right.
And so now let's move on to movement while we got into that training. And by the way, muscle mass, we've known for decades that the more muscle mass you have as you get into your later years, the better that you're going to age. But now they're talking about something called muscle-centric healthcare, realizing that muscles are communicating with every tissue of the body. There's this term called myokine, a muscle communication molecule. Some people have heard of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, but there's over 700 identified myokines. And I've got to tell you, if something has, is it that much of your being and has that much of a signaling opportunity, it's got to be important. So let's talk about movement. And where do you start with people in terms of, let's say someone says, okay, it's time to get back in shape. Where do you start with that person? Because there's a lot of people that are saying that.
Right. I think prioritizing strength training is very important, especially as we get over 40, which is the majority of my clients. But we got to prioritize strength training 2, maybe 3 days a week of getting to a point where we're putting some stress on those muscles to let the body know we need to hang on to this muscle, right? We need to hang on to this tissue. It's important, as well as the bone density. So that should be, I think, the first priority to get done in the week, in my opinion, along with some sort of zone 1 just movement, ideally outside where there's some sun, just walking, right? Just getting some movement in, or whether if that's a bike or something simple that you have in your home, it could be a stationary bike, but we just need kind of that low level movement as well as some strength training. And if they're up for it, if they're physically conditioned, or they don't have some sort of issue that would keep them from going into a higher intensity cardiovascular state, getting some higher intensity work in there, either it's high intensity interval training or some sort of sprint training. Again, it could be on a bike, could be on sprinting outside, whatever they want to use, but getting the heart rate up and really polarizing their cardiovascular training. I'm not a fan of the real long duration middle zone, like zone 3, zone 4, extended for 45 minutes to an hour. I think can be, for some people, create more of that stress response than we really want. I like short bouts high, and then a lot more in that zone 1 or very low zone 2. As you get that in, just again, polarizing the training. So very low and very high on the cardio side, along with the strength training. And that would be my kind of starting points. Like, how do we work these into your schedule with your current level of fitness and any sort of physical restrictions you might have?
I want to dive into that prolonged cardio for a moment, because there's people that love it. And if you love it, hey, enjoy every magic moment of it.
Right.
I've worked with a number of Olympic athletes, and my Olympic coach will have everybody, including the 100-meter runners, and they hate doing a 3-mile run, but once a week they do a 3-mile run. And you know what? They keep track of their time, and they want them to get better. And, my mindset is always train every fiber type from the slowest to the fastest, every energy system from the slowest to the fastest, proportional to the demands of what you want to do with them. And so, if you're going to be a basketball player, there's going to be a lot of intense intervals there. Whereas, a golfer, they still need the energy systems, but nowhere near the level of intensity, right? And they'll focus better if everything works better as well. So you described a zone 1. How many zones are there, and how much time should people spend in those zones? Zone 1 is simple walking in the sunshine. 5 is all out. And what about in between?
Well, again, I think there's some nuance there. There's 5 zones. 5 is all out. Zone 2 is generally what we think of as cardio, where we're jogging. It's just enough to create a cardiovascular adaptation, but you can usually, at least in the lower ends of it, be able to talk during it or breathe through your nose through most of zone 2. Zone 3 is when we're probably puffing a little bit more through our mouth, a little more challenging. 4, you usually can't maintain for very long unless you're really a trained athlete. It'd be hard to stay up there, where you're at maybe a 75 to 85% of your max heart rate in that zone 4. And then zone 5 is you're sprinting, right? You're all out sprinting. It's 85, 90 up, give or take, depending on the person. So the zone 1 is your typical brisk walk. And that out in the sun is probably I think over and over being shown to be the best for longevity as well as general health. The zone 3, that right in the middle, like I mentioned, I think over long term, if you enjoy that, great. I just keep an eye on your stress levels, your cortisol, your heart as you get older, maybe injuries. Try not to ignore the pain. If you're getting in that space and you're starting to notice some negative feedback, it might be time to kind of change things up. Maybe not do it as often. Whether it's physical pain in the feet, the legs, back, or even a disrupted HRV. If you're tracking like you are with the Oura Ring or Whoop strap, and you might notice your HRV is coming down, or maybe your heart rate is staying a little elevated at night, more so than usual. Could be signs of overtraining, and you might want to adjust your frequency in that or the duration in that middle zone. I think there's room for it. I just not crazy about long, unless you're really competing. I don't know that there's a great benefit compared to the risk as we get older of doing a lot of long-term stuff in that middle zone. And that's my experience.
Well, I've worked with so many different coaches, and we know that anybody that does a marathon, everybody that does a marathon, there's both electrical and biochemical evidence of cardiac damage. And when people are in the 100 Marathon Club, half of those people have severe scarring of their heart. But here's the interesting thing. The other half don't. So what's the difference, right? It's probably in the recovery and the nutrition and the sleep. And by the way, while we're talking about recovery, let's now go to sleep, which, I think probably needs a lot more attention in general in our society. But what's your take on sleep? Do you have any sleep hacks that you really enjoy?
It is probably one of the more elusive ones, I think, for people, especially people who are kind of high driving to come and land. As we get a little older, it takes more time to land the plane, I think, to really get ourselves out of that go mode and into a parasympathetic state where we can really get in some deep sleep early. We got to respect our sleep schedule, especially when we go to bed. I think on a fairly consistently, like ideally within an hour on a nightly basis, without a whole lot of fluctuation, to get those early deep sleep hours in, which come at the first part of the sleep cycle, and then the REM comes later, which I think sometimes is sacrificed by these really early morning workouts where people getting up at 3:30 or 4 o'clock to try to get to the gym, and that's when your body might be getting at least half of its REM sleep in there, which is important for just dealing with stress, with stressful issues. It's kind of how we work out some of our stressors and organizing memories all the way through there. I think it's been sacrificed in the name of being productive for many decades, like our generation especially. The 80s, it was like, I'll sleep when I'm dead, right? That was the thing we heard from leaders, and yet we can now see the impact on metabolic disease, even maybe dementia eventually. We need our recovery, we need our sleep. And like we mentioned before, eating too close to bedtime can throw that off. I think a hard workout right before bedtime could also throw that off. Any type of work-related activity, blue light, or basically any kind of light that's going to be in your house, I would start eliminating that or reducing it, whether you change out for red light bulbs or you're wearing blue light blocking glasses to reduce the stimulation of your eyes, which are direct. That's a great direction right into your brain, right? That's a great stimulation right into your brain. If you have a lot of bright light coming in your eyes before bed, you're like telling your brain the sun is up, essentially. And so if we can start letting our brains prepare for sleep and let it know, hey, it's dark outside, the sun's been down, let's keep that communication going with our brain of when daylight really is and when dark really is, to really, let our bodies slow down and prepare for that rest. I think there's some breathing techniques people can do if they really have trouble with that, nasal breathing to really stimulate the parasympathetic. But whatever you can do to separate yourself from work, from stress, to calm the body down prior to going to bed, it can be very beneficial to really getting into those the deep sleep stages, as well as having time in REM. So there's a lot. It's almost sleep, I think, is elusive because we don't think of what can we do. Like when we want to work out, we know what to do to work out. With eating, we know there's things to do to to prepare our food or to make choices there. Sleep seems like we're unconscious during it, so it's not a real active thing that we can control. It's almost like proactive habits that happen before you get there that need to be in place before that sleep quality can be really established.
Well, you again said so many different powerful things that are there, and you brought in the big three, right? So you don't want to eat too close to bed. You actually don't want to drink too close to bed. We, especially us men after 40, right? So now we've got the prostate that could wake us up to pee. And you also don't want to move too close to bed because the primary determinant of circadian rhythm is actually motion. Because there's places in the world that they have 40 days of darkness, 40 days of light. And, these people still have a fairly regular schedule, but they've got to move their body. If we go back a couple hundred years ago, they actually estimate that people were in active motion 60 hours a week. So when you're talking about, does that mean 60 hours in zone 1, probably just moving around, getting through their life. So we've changed everything. We're eating completely different. We're moving nowhere near like we used to. Right. Somehow we got the idea that sleep isn't important. So you've got a couple minutes to wrap it up for everybody. What message do you want to leave with everybody? And by the way, what's the best way for people to get a hold of you?
Well, I think the message would be that you stick with foundations. Start with foundations, I should say. Don't stick with them, but start with them and be consistent. It's what you do across years, right? That really add up. And so with the whole food, regular movement, on your sleep cycle, and then whatever you build on top of that. As we get older, a lot of people want to move into maybe some bioidentical hormone replacement or try to throw some peptides in there to help with recovery. And I think realize you can't out hack the foundations, which are diet, exercise, and sleep. As long as your foundations are in place, that's 80, maybe 90% of the benefits you're going to get, and everything else is very beneficial. And can help you maintain those foundations, but they aren't a replacement for those foundations. And so let's not try to out-hack, poor sleep habits, poor eating habits, and a lack of serious movement. But you can reach me at zanegriggs.com. Really has all my socials there, so you can figure out how you want to connect with me, whether it's through the podcast or my Instagram, where I'm most active at Zane Griggs Fitness. But zanegriggs.com is the best hub to find what you're looking for.
Beautiful. And you know what? You summarize it as well as anybody ever has. I've got a patient who's a Hall of Famer in Kung Fu. And he trains people that become national champions even before they get a black belt in a school. And his name's Rick Armstrong. I asked him, I said, Rick, what makes you such a great teacher? He says, Bob, I teach my students, if you master the basics, you'll seldom need anything else. So if you're going unprocessed, one ingredient per meal, if you have beef, have beef. If you have broccoli, right? Don't make these complex meals. They're more difficult on your digestive system. Basic movement and plenty of it, and prioritize sleep. And by the way, there's even a book called Eat, Move, Sleep. And Tom Rath, the guy that wrote it, right? He wrote it because for him, it was literally life-saving and life-enhancing, as it can be for all of us. So I'll wrap up with these words. I'm Dr. Bob Rakowski, absolutely knowing that we can all be happy, healthy, and successful. And Zane Griggs, thank you for your contributions to the planet. You lead by example. I think we'll probably schedule another conversation down the road because there's so much to get into, but we're at that magic 30-minute point. So we'll step out from there. But thank you for sharing, and thank you for making the world better.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. I appreciate you inviting me on.